Angular data binding. So data binding in Angular, we discussed how we can use the concepts like interpolation. Interpolation means we use a binding expression. We learned how to use property binding. Property binding means in a square brace we have to define. We learned about how to use attribute binding. Attribute binding, so we have to give ATTR and attribute name. Okay, that's how we need to define. Properties, we just use the property name, right? The difference between them we discussed. What is interpolation, what is property, and what is attribute binding difference we learned. Now, another important you need to know is about, so a important notice, interpolation, property binding, and attribute binding, all are one-way binding. All are one-way binding techniques. All are one-way binding techniques. Interpolation, property binding, attribute binding, all are one-way binding techniques. What is meant by when one-way binding technique means? One-way binding means it will read the data and it will bind to UI. Any change in the data will not update back. It is not going to update back. So what is one-way binding? So I will give you a simple way. One-way binding is nothing but it is the process of accessing data from source and binding to UI elements. We can bind to UI elements. Any change in UI will not update back. Any change in the UI will not update back. So that is what actually one-way binding. So whatever present in the data source, it will bind to the UI. Any change in the UI, it will not update back actually. It is not going to update back. That is one-way binding. So this is okay when you are trying to display some information. But when we want to make the changes, then this is not okay. Let's see. One simple example we will see. So here I will give you a sample. Let's go to our project. I'll just give you one simple example to understand. Means how we can use the one-way binding technique. Let's run this project ng serve shopping. So here I am creating a property called, it is a data binding component. In this we are creating a property public. Property is some name. It is a string type. Initially it is empty. Nothing is defined. And we want to display here. I will put a heading. I will show you here one-way binding. Here name, we will put a text box. Input type is equal to text. And in this text box, we want to display this name. Whatever name is there, we want to display. By default, suppose the name is given as John, and we want to display that in the text box. Let's see how we can do that. Successfully compiled. Yeah. You see now, to display in the text box, what we can do, in the text box we have a property called value. Property binding means square brace. What is the property? Value. Into that we will apply the name. That means whatever you stored in this name, you are displaying inside text box. So you can see it is working fine. The same we will display here also. Below I will put a paragraph and I will say hello, and I will display the name. Using interpolation we will use the name. Now you see the name is displayed here, whatever is in the text box. Actually now what is the concept here is, we have a simple name property. In that we have John. What is happening here? It is going to add that. So it is going to display this inside this text box, and any change. So here the same is displayed here also. Am I right? Two locations we are displaying. So what should happen if I do any modification in this? It should update back here. Am I right? And that should be again affected here. So that means whatever the modification you done, it should update into this name. And if name is updated, it should automatically affect in the UI. But you see now I am doing some modifications. It is not working. You can see. That means whatever changes you are making in the UI, these changes are not affected into the data store. This is called one-way binding. One-way binding means there is some data in memory. We can access the data and display. But any change happened in that is not reflected back. That is one-way binding technique. Actually, two-way binding is identifying the changes and updating back. So that is the correct concept. That means one-way binding is this. What is two-way binding? Two-way binding means it is the process of accessing data from source and bind to UI. Next, identify the changes in UI and update back to source. This is the two-way binding technique. So first access the data and display in the UI. If any modification happened in the UI, you have to update back. Generally, how you do this in JavaScript? In JavaScript, how you will identify the changes made in text box and update back those changes into the source. How we do this in JavaScript? Actually, JavaScript have to depend on lot of DOM methods and browser events. JavaScript have to depend on lot of DOM methods and browser events. If I have to do this in JavaScript, lot of DOM methods and browser events are required. That means I will show you. Suppose here we have, I'm showing your JavaScript how it actually works. Actually, suppose you have a variable, some name is equal to John. Now this name must be displayed in a text box. That name must be displayed in a text box. So this text box have an ID called txt name. Then what we have to do in order to get the value and display in text box, what is the option we have to do? We have to write, what is it? Document dot get element by ID. What is it? Txt name dot value is equal to whatever the name you entered. That is what we have to do. That is what we need to do, right? This is accessing the data and displaying in the text box. How to identify change happened in the text box or not? For that, what we have to do is we have to use events like on change. We have to use events like on key up, means when key is released, or we have to use events like on blur. On blur means once you lose the focus, that means you click inside text box, that is focus. Click outside, that is blur. So on blur, on change, on key up, so many events we have to use. On that event, what we have to do? So we have to again reverse apply this name is equal to, we have to use document dot get element by ID. What is it? Txt name dot value. That is how we have to do generally in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, in order to handle two-way binding, we have to depend on lot of DOM methods and we have to depend on lot of events. But now we can handle this in a simple way. How we can handle is Angular can manage two-way binding by using frameworks like MVC and MVVM. Angular can manage two-way binding by using frameworks like MVC and MVVM. So client side, it can use the framework called MVC and MVVM. What is MVC? What is MVVM? A small difference and example we will see. So what makes it simple? Actually, remember this two-way binding which Angular is having, it is not there in React also. So one of the competitor for Angular is React, and React don't have two-way binding. React have only one-way binding, and React, they have to use again same like JavaScript. They have to depend on events. They have to depend on DOM updations and all. But Angular like frameworks have a facility of working with MVC and MVVM client side. What is advantage? I will tell you. What is MVC? Actually, you will learn about such frameworks in your technology later when you learn Java, Spring, ASP.NET, MVC like .NET, you will understand about those things. Actually, MVC stands for Model View Controller. Actually, we call it is a software architectural pattern. It is a software architectural pattern. MVC is a software architectural pattern. What is meant by software architectural pattern? Architectural pattern can build application and can build and control the application flow. An architectural pattern can build the application and control the application flow. Controlling application flow means from where to pick the data, where to display the data, how to identify the changes in the data, update back. All these are done by architectural patterns. MVC is an software architectural pattern. Actually, what is history we don't need here. Later you will learn in your technologies. So actually MVC was introduced by Trigave in early 1970s. And it was first formulated, means MVC formulated means first used with a language called Smalltalk. Smalltalk uses that MVC. After that, every technology is using MVC. Java uses MVC by name Spring. PHP uses MVC by name Cake PHP, Code Igniter. Python uses MVC by name Django, Flask, Grok, right? Ruby uses MVC by name Ruby on Rails. .NET uses MVC by name ASP.NET MVC. JavaScript is using MVC by name Spine. It is using in Angular. It is using in Backbone. So many are there. These are all MVC. Various technologies are using MVC. And MVC is not a new concept. It is a very old concept. But all technologies are now using this very much. Everywhere we are using this MVC framework. What is advantage in this framework is actually it enables code reusability and code separation. Code reusability and code separation. We can reuse the code and we can cleanly separate the code. That is the main intention of MVC. Actually, MVC contains three components. What is it? Model, view, and controller. Model represents the data. Simple. Data is represented by model. And view represents UI, user interface, and controller represents application logic. Data is model, interface is view, and logic is application logic is controller. Actually, controller, what it will do, it handles the overall communication between, so it handles overall communication between model and view. It handles the communication between model and view. So this is the model view controller approach, MVC approach, right? So technically, how this generally works, I will simply show you here. Actually, what happens is here, we have a controller and we have a view and we have a model. Just take example of our Angular component. Controller is this TS file. TS file is the controller. And the HTML is view. And model is data. Data can be anywhere outside. It can be coming from database, server side technology. It can be coming from API. We saw fake store API and all. It can come from any location actually. So generally model means here in JavaScript based technologies, it is in the form of JSON. You know already data in a JSON format. It will be in a JSON format, JSON. So the controller, the view and the model. It is the controller view and the model. Actually, we have data here. This data will go to controller. From the controller, it is sent to the view, to the UI. So if any change occurred in the view, that is back, any change occurred in the view, it is back updated to controller. It is updated back to the controller. Now what controller will do? Those changes, it will update back into the model. It will update into the model. So directly model will not have any communication with view. View will not have any communication with model. Directly data from model, it goes to controller, from controller to view. Actually, to manage this in JavaScript, you have to use a lot of events. What is specialty in our Angular is using this framework internally. Internally, Angular is using this framework. And this entire framework functionality is managed by a directive called ng model. ng model is a directive. ng model is a directive. It is a directive. Already I told you a component directive. We discussed a component directive. All components are derived from this directive. And there is a directive model. What is this ng model? ng is for Angular, Angular model. It internally uses this MVC framework. It will use both MVC, MVVM framework. What is specialty here is, see, that means this ng model, how to access the data and display in view. Now, just now I told you in JavaScript, to access the data and display in the UI, we need DOM methods. In Angular, what we can do is, we can use square brace. What is this? This is property binding. By using property binding, what we can do, we can access the data and display. We can access the data and display, right? So that already we are doing here now. By using property binding, we are accessing the data and displaying. Now to identify the changes in this, any change happened in this, and update back into the data, we need event binding. Actually, events in Angular, I will tell you how to write events. Later, we will have events related list we will discuss. Generally, in JavaScript, how to write event. Suppose button click event you have to write. Suppose we have a button, and for a button, so suppose I written as alert, okay. On this alert button, I have to show alert hello. Then how to write generally? First in the logic TypeScript file, because here everything is a method, right? How do we write? We will write a method public, so that is click, right? Or say, I will simply say button click. On button click, we will put an alert. So I will say clicked. Understood? Now generally this we have to access on button click. In HTML, how do we write? On click. On click is equal to what? Button click. This is how we write. But in Angular, just a change. We have to write events in parentheses. And it is not on click, that is click. That means we don't use just on, that is. All JavaScript events are same. Right? Key events, mouse events, button events, everything. We are not going to discuss them here. Right? We are not going to discuss JavaScript events here. We will use them here. Right? All those events are same. Only the option on will not be there. You will have click, you will have change, we will have key up, key down, key press, mouse over, mouse out, like that. So just Events are defined in a parenthesis. And you observe now, when I click on that alert, alert will come. Same how you use it in JavaScript, just difference is in JavaScript you will have a function. Here you will have a method. In JavaScript you have on click, here you will have a click. In JavaScript you will directly write on click, here you write in a parenthesis. So what is event binding is defined in a parenthesis. Amar, this is event binding. Now in order to handle two-way binding means access the data and display in UI and identify the changes and update back. To handle two-way binding, you need two techniques. One property binding, another one event binding. Am I right? In order to handle two-way binding, we need two things, property binding and event binding. Now, who is going to manage this in Angular? Property binding and event binding is to be managed by this NG model. NG model manages property binding and event binding. So we have to write simply like this. First, access the data and display in UI. First is property binding. That means square brace. After that, identifying the changes and update back to data. That is what? Event binding. Who is going to manage NG model? This is two-way binding. That is two-way binding. That's very simple. You don't need to write extra methods. You don't need to write events. You don't need to write any DOM methods. Just you have to write this. And from where it has to bring data and where it has to store data. From where it has to bring data and where it has to store data from a property called name. That means whatever present in the name, it will get it and display. Whatever changes happen, it will update back. How you are saying that it will get and display, how it will update back? Because of these two techniques. One is property binding, another one event binding, managed by whom? NG model. So it's very simple now. So what you have to do is, I am removing this button. I am removing this event. Just you see now, here we have to remove this value. We have to write a simple square brace. That is property binding. In that parenthesis, that is event binding. Who will manage? NG model. From where? Name. That's how we have to define. And very important is, actually, in order to use this NG model is not directly available in Angular. Actually, NG model is present in forms module. This forms module is present in Angular forms library. So you have to first import this, then only you can use it. And where to import our libraries? Already we know. We have to import in app module. In app module, already we have two modules ready. Here we have to import what? We have to import from which location? @Angular/forms. From Angular forms, we have to import a module. What is it? Forms module. We have to import the forms module from Angular forms. Once you import, after importing modules must be registered in imports. I told you components must be registered in declarations and modules must be registered in imports. Whatever modules you are going to use, you have to register in this imports. So which module we have to register? Forms module. We have to register the forms module. Now this NG model can be used. Otherwise you cannot use it. NG model is available only when you do it. Now see, simply there is a property called name and you are using this NG model to bind. No code, nothing, no logic, nothing, right? Now see what happens. Here it is name and whatever the changes we are making, it is updating back. Right? Whatever the changes we are making, it is updating back. It is updating back. That's how it makes the changes. 1 second. Okay. So now here you can see we are not using any kind of logic, any kind of interactions, no events, no manipulations. Just we have one reference and everything is managed by this NG model. So what, if anyone asks how NG model is doing this, that means in the background, it is using this framework. What is that framework? MVC. In this framework, it can identify the data coming from, name and it will bind to this text box and through which option it will bind by using this property binding. Understood? Through property binding, it will get the name and it will display in text box. If any change occurred, how it will identify? The change by using event binding, it will identify. By using event binding, it can identify the change and update back to this name. So earlier we have to depend on a lot of logic. It's very simple now. So earlier JavaScript get element by ID and display somewhere. We have to just use NG model. But NG model is not directly available. NG model is present in a separate module called forms. You have to import this module, then only you can use NG mod, right? Let's see the process how to do. That means, so NG model is going to manage everything. NG model. So it is an Angular directive used to manage two-way binding. Understood? Two-way binding. So it uses property binding. Property binding is square brace to access the data from source and bind to UI. It uses event binding in a parenthesis to access the data from UI and bind to source that is property binding and event binding. So event binding to access the data, not only access, it also identifies the changes in data. Understood? It also identifies the changes in data and updates back. That is the reason we have to use like this. Square brace, in that parenthesis, we have to use NG model. ng model is equal to some reference name. Whatever the reference name is there, you have to define. And very important, ng model is a member of forms module. Forms module defined in which library? Angular forms library. Angular forms library. That means in order to use ng model, first you have to import forms module. So example, first I will give a good example. First step, what you have to do? Step 1 here. So import and register forms module in app.module.ts. app.module.ts. You have to import and register the forms module in app module.ts. We have to do that. So we have to import there. How to import? I will just give you. So I will just give you here in app module. This is how we have to import at the top. Already I told you, I have seen so many people yesterday, last session, asking doubts. They are deleting everything and keeping only what I given. No, you should keep all of them. You add these additionally, not deleting everything and keep only one, right? So many people were trying that. Don't do that. So in the imports, we have to use the forms module. Imports, we have to use the forms module. Already there may be several other modules. Just we have to add the forms module. That is first step. Second step, what we have to do? Step 2, we have to bind to the UI elements. That means second step, we have to create a property, public, some name. It is what type? String. In that we can store some data. In the third step, we have to attach this to UI. That means what we have to do? Input type is equal to text. In that we have to use simply in square brace parenthesis ng model, and the reference is name. That's it. These are the 3 steps you need to follow. And you don't need to do this every day. Once you imported forms module, every day you can use directly this technique. You just declare a property and you can bind to the UI. Let's create a simple example now and see. What is the specialty about this ng model is, depending on which HTML element you are binding, it can identify which property to read. For example, I am binding with text box. Then can you tell me to which property name is assigned? To which property of text box name is assigned? To which property it will be assigned? Value. It is intelligent enough to understand that. Suppose if I am using input type is equal to checkbox, and in a checkbox I given some ng model, okay, and I given some stock, something like this. Now very important here, to which element it will apply this, to which property it will apply. So here, depending on the type, suppose above I have public, we have stock. Stock is what type? Boolean. That means it is using true or false. Can you tell me to which property ng model will apply stock? Will it up? Checkbox is also having value, na? It will not apply to value because its type is what? Boolean. In checkbox, which one is a Boolean? In checkbox, Boolean property is checked. Understood? That means ng model is intelligent enough. According to the type of value, it can bind to that property. Suppose you given a string, it will bind to value. You given a Boolean, it will bind to the Boolean property. Later we can bind to any another specific. I will show you. Let's design a simple form and see. Let's create one example to understand how this two-way binding works. So see now, I will go to the two-way binding here, binding, data binding. Here we will create one simple design we will create. See, here we are creating an object. Here we are creating an object. So not only object, you remembered we discussed about contracts. We learned contracts now. Whenever we are working with TypeScript based technologies, there we use a lot of contracts and all. See what I am doing now. I am creating a separate folder in the app. In the app, I will create a separate folder called contracts. In that, I will add a new file called product contract.ts. How to design contracts already we learned. Export, interface. Why export? Because we have to use in another location. Interface name is what? Product contract. According to the contract, it will have a name, what type, string type, we have a price, what type, number type, we have a stock, it is an Boolean type. Like this we define. So name, price, stock. Again, suppose city, it is a string type. Okay. Now once the contract is defined, I want to use that contract in my component. Then we have to import that contract here. Import. What to import? Product contract from contracts. From the contracts, we have to import. All this we have learned. How to import, how to write a separate file, module systems we discussed already. Now, here I am creating, so a public, a property called product. It is of type product contract. Understood? According to the type, it should have name. Name is what type? String. Some name I am giving here. Or I will just keep it empty, nothing, string. Another one is price. I will keep it 0. Another one is stock. I will put as false. Another one is city. I will just keep as some city. Just some string. So I will keep empty. Nothing is defined here. So I will just keep that empty. Or I will simply put select a city. Select a city, that is the default option defined. So see now here, what we need to do is we need to bind this and display these details. So this is an object. These details we need to bind in the UI. So I am creating a heading, product register. So product details. I am just giving product details. You learned some bootstrap and all these things. I will do like this. I will create a container class as row. In that we have a div. This class as call3. Another div. This class as call9. This is a simple bootstrap classes we are using. And here I will say, so product register product. And in this we have data list, data term, name. For name, we will keep a text box. Input type is equal to text. And we have another term, price. And data definition, input type is equal to text. Another data term we have stock. For stock, I will give a checkbox. Input type is equal to checkbox. Okay. And here I will say available here. Available. Okay. And I have another term. This is a city. And I will put a drop down here. We will put an option. Select a city. And we have option like Delhi. So we have option like Hyderabad. Like this we are using. Now you can see this is the form we have. We designed a form like this. And we will keep a good appearance for this. I will use a class form control. For this text box, form control. And for this checkbox, form control means they will come like this. And for this checkbox, I will use as a class form switch. And this will use a class called form check input. We will use form check input. And you can see it will be like a checkbox. This is a modern checkbox. It is a form switch, right? In Bootstrap, the modern checkboxes will be like this. And below, I will use a class called form select. This is a drop down actually. These are all the options. So we designed a form. Now whatever entered in the form, we have to collect and display beside. So beside we want to display. So here we are just writing. So product details. In the product details we want to show. So I will just use a data list. So here we will put a class as row, data term class as call3, and here I will say name. And data definition, we have a class called call9. And the same will repeat, one for name, another for price, and another for stock. Here we have like stock, and another for city, another for city. Like this we define name, price, stock, and city. And here what we are doing is simply, here we want to display name. From where it will come, we have an object called product. Product have a property called name. Similarly, price. Price will come. So product dot price. Stock. Stock will come from product dot what? Stock. City will come from product dot city. Like this. All those details will come here. Initially, they are empty. That means you can see name is empty, nothing is there. Price is 0. Stock is false. And select city, it is there. So you have that select city here. Now what should happen is, whenever user is entering the details in these text boxes, we need to update them in this UI. It's very simple. We have to bind this, right? We have to bind the name and all these to these controls. How to bind with the controls? Very simple now. Two-way binding technique. What is it? Square brace. In that parenthesis, what is it? ng model. It will come from where? Product dot name. That's it. That means whatever name is there, it will bind to text box. And any change happen, it will update back. Similarly, we have to use another. What is it? ng model. What is that? Product dot price. Dot price. Similarly for checkbox, here we have to use ng model. And what is it? Product dot stock. And here for drop down, we have to use another. What is it? ng model. What we have to do? Product dot city. It's done. Now you can see all those details are here. Observe. I am entering some name, automatically it will get that. I am entering some price, it will get that price. I am changing the stock, it says true. Instead of true, we will put some value. For example, what you can do here, because it is a stock boolean, you can put a parenthesis. So if it is equal to true, then question mark, ternary operator. We will use available, and a colon, we will put out of stock. That means if it is true, it will print available. Otherwise, it will print out of stock. That is a simple Boolean expression. Currently out of stock, you entered some name, you entered some price, and you turned on this, it will say available. You turn off, then it says out of stock. And you select a city here, that city will come. So whatever you are choosing, it will display that here, right? So this is two-way binding. That means we are accessing data from the source. We are binding to UI, and any modification happened in the UI, it is updating back. Earlier in JavaScript, we have to do lot of events and DOM manipulation. But now we can simply handle that by using this technique. Just we have to use this ng model. We can bind and we can handle the interaction. Later we will see how to work with button clicks and all. This is just one example first. Technically, how two-way binding works. What is two-way binding and how two-way binding works. So two-way binding works with a simple directive called ng model. And it uses, now many times people ask, is it mandatory to write in this order? Sometimes generally people do mistakes like writing in a parenthesis square brace. There is an order for this. First one, property binding. Second one, event binding. First we have to get the value and display in UI for that first property. After that, any change in the UI update back to the property, that is event binding. You have to use in the same order. Actually, in old versions of Angular, we don't have a recognition for this error. That means even anybody writes like this, it will take. But at runtime, it will show error saying that you are using wrong characters. But now in Angular 14, they improved better error support. While typing itself, it will verify that you are writing wrong syntax and it will alert you. So Angular 14 comes with more advanced error support, which was not there in earlier versions. In earlier versions, even I write a wrong in the UI, it is not going to recognize. It will recognize at runtime. That is the reason I need to wait until I run whether it is true, correct or wrong. But now it is better. Before you run, it will automatically verify and show you. This was not there earlier. Actually, in old version of Angular, when you are writing ng model, see here, suppose I am writing ng model. When I am writing here ng model, so when I am writing ng model, it will not, you see, it is saying expected token equal. That means it is saying that you need some value to be passed into it. Actually, even you give wrong syntax, that means in a parenthesis square brace, and you say ng model, now it is showing an error. So expression is empty and it is not allowed. That means two-way binding syntax, parenthesis should be in brackets. That means the parenthesis should be inside the square brackets. It will give you the correct process. This type of help is not there in old version. That is the reason accidentally even you write wrong, it will not show error. Once you run, then error comes. That is difficult, that is risky. But now it is having better support. So a good support for errors, error handling, right? That is important. So this is example of how we can access data and display in the UI. Now here, what is the controller? Controller is this TS file, understood? So it is playing the key role. Data comes here, and from here again data goes to UI. That means all the manipulations are happened in the controller. This is one approach called MVC, right? So example for this, I will give data binding. Data binding.component.ts. In the TS file, I will copy this code. And another one, data binding dot data binding dot component dot HTML. In this is the design. This is entire design. I will just copy that here. Later we will see more complex examples after this next level. First we need to understand basic how MVC works. There is another technique. Another technique is, instead of using MVC, you can use another framework, MVVM. MVVM is actually model view and view model. What is advantage of this is it will reduce the effort of, it will reduce the use of controller. It is model view and view model. It will reduce the use of controller. What is advantage of reducing the use of controller? I told you we can have inline technique, code behind technique. In inline technique, what happens? Everything present in only one file. One file. We will not have separate files. That means it is good. It is good for inline technique. Inline technique components. Am I right? It is good for inline technique components because all are present in one file. Then what is problem? Problem is separation and reusability, extensibility issues will come. So what is the problem? Extensibility issues. So another one is reusability issues. Reusability issues will come regularly. But it is good if you are not expecting extending, reusing regularly. That means sometimes we design a component in such a way that it will have only stable functionality. It will not extend, it will not change. We don't add some new things into it. We will keep it as we designed it. In that case, this is very good. But how this MVVM works? MVVM is nothing but what happens is, here we have model view controller. But this time what will happen is we will have a view here. Two options will be there. We will have a view and we will have a model. Now generally model contains the data, the view contains the UI. What we do is actually we are keeping the logic in a controller. Am I right? Our logic is present in controller, but this time we keep the logic in the view only. We keep the logic in the view only. We call this as view model. So we call this as view model. That means there is no separate controller. This view contains the logic. The view contains the logic. In the view itself, logic is defined. If in the view itself logic is defined, model sends to view model, from there to view. This view model is not separate, it is a part of view. And it will update back to view model, which will update to the model. What is drawback of this? What is good about this? It will reduce the number of requests. If it reduces the number of requests, it will be fast. But what is drawback? The view becomes heavy. View becomes heavy because logic and design both are present in the same page. If logic and design both are present in same page, then it becomes heavy on page. Earlier what we have done, we kept logic separate and UI separate. Now UI and logic are both in one page. It will reduce number of requests. It will improve the time. But the problem is it is heavy on applications and it is hard to extend. It is heavy on applications and it is hard to extend. This is the problem. That is the reason if you don't need regular extensions, you don't need regular changes in the application interface, then better go with this approach. So how MVVM works? This is also managed by NG model only. This is also managed by NG model, but in a different way. See how it will manage. See what we will do now. MVVM is nothing but So what we do here, same example. Here we are not having anything in controller, keep it empty. There is nothing in the controller, keep it empty, nothing, empty. Now in that case I have to delete all this. So there is nothing in the controller, okay, keep it clean. So there is no product at all, okay, there is no product at all. We will keep everything empty. We will remove all this and keep it empty. So there is no product at all, so we will keep that here. Now see, this is empty interface, and this time we are not touching this controller. There is nothing in the controller. There is nothing in the controller. What we have to do here, very simple, go to the UI. In the UI, first important, we have to make this text box dynamic. Every element in HTML is static. We have to make it dynamic. For that, we have to define ng model that makes dynamic. Okay, this becomes dynamic. After that, whatever you entered in this text box, it must be accessed. In that case, you know already, you learnt in HTML. In HTML, when you design a form and elements in form, I hope you already learned that every element in form must have a name. You know that? If name is not there, then form cannot submit its value, right? That means an element value is not submitted by form if there is no name given for element. So as per the rules of form, every element must have a name. So every element should have a name. What is the name? I will give as name. Now text box becomes dynamic. After becoming dynamic, it is able to submit its value. But where that submitted value must be stored? It should be stored in the memory. Who will allocate the memory? The same model will allocate the memory. What should be the memory name? We have to define with an hash. With an hash, memory name is name. Who is going to manage this memory? It ng model. That is how we have to write. Now this becomes dynamic, and whatever you enter in text box, it will be stored in the UI only, in the user interface only. That means there is no separate controller now. We have to store everything in the UI. For that, you have to do three things. First, every element must have a name. Second, make it dynamic by using ng model. Third, give a reference name. Reference name is given with hash. Reference name is given with hash. Who will manage that reference? ng model. That means whatever data is present inside it, it will access and display in UI. Whatever change happened, it will update back to the UI. You don't need event binding, property binding like techniques now. You can directly manage like this. Every element now needs like this. So let's see for price now. What we have to do? ng model. After that, name. What is the name? Price. What is the reference? Price. Who will manage? That's it. Similarly for checkbox, ng model. So what is it? Name. Name is what? Stock. So hash what? Stock. Who will manage? ng model. Same. Here also select. What is it? ng model. Name is what? City. What is it? Hash city is equal to ng model. That's it. That is how we can make the elements dynamic. Now very important is, that means three stages are there. So how to configure? That means configure dynamic element in UI. How to configure dynamic element in UI? We first point, every element must have name. Second, every element must be dynamic by using what? NG model. That means every element must have a dynamic reference name. Understood? Dynamic reference name. It is given with hash any name. You have to define. That means syntactically what we have to do, we have to use ng model. We have to use, so name is equal to some name, and we have to use, so what is it? Hash name is equal to ng model, and its type can be anything. Understood? Type can be text or checkbox or radio, anything you can have the type. So it can be any type. Now important is, now one more thing you should know is every model reference contains lot of properties, various properties. Every model reference is contains lot of, actually I can simply say that every model reference is an object with various properties. That means now what is this name? We given a reference name na? Hash name. Hash name is an object. What this object contains? It contains lot of properties like, it contains properties like value. It contains property like valid. It contains property like invalid. It contains property like pristine. It contains property like dirty, like touched, like untouched. All these are the options. These are all the properties. We are going to learn all these properties in validation. We will learn about them. Currently, we need only one, value. Value means it will get and show what is the value present in the text box. That means, see now what I am doing here. I want to display the name here. Here I am accessing simply in binding expression. I am accessing name, and you can observe that it will say that name is an object. Right? Every model reference is an object. That object contains a property. What is that property? Value. Now what is this? Is simple. This time no controller. No controller. The same thing we have to do everywhere. That means what we have to do? We have to say price dot value. Here what we have to say? So here we will put stock dot value is equal to what? True. Then we will keep as available. Otherwise out of stock. And city, how do we define the city? We have to say city dot value. That's it. And you can see now I entered the details. It will get that and display. And turn on, here it is available. I select a name, it will display. What is difference between the previous example and current? In previous example, our data have to go to controller. From controller again it should come to view. From view again it should go to controller. From controller again it should go to model. But now no controller. You see everything is managed in a page only. The controller is empty, nothing is there. Name, price, everything is present inside the UI only. What is good and bad? Good is if you are using inline technique, it will best suitable for you. But bad is it is heavy on page. Because everything is happening in UI, it will be slow also. Slow in what? Rendering output. But it will be fast in loading initially. Why it will be fast in loading initially? Number of requests are category is what type? String type. I given here as some electronics, something like this. Now I want to bind this. I want to bind this to any drop down. I want to bind this to I will say category. I want to bind it. Now here what we will do, select. We have an option. What is it? Electronics. And I have an option like footwear, something like this. And we have an option like fashion, something we defined. Now here I will use form select. And here I can use two-way binding, NG model. Understood? Because its reference is in the controller. I can access and I can use it here. That means here I can use, what is it? Category. Then I want to display the category also here. Then data term. So here we have class colon 3. And here we defined category. And data definition. So we have a class column 9. And here we are displaying directly what category. We are accessing directly the category and displaying. And you can see directly category will come here, right? You entered the details, it will come. Now, in this example, we are using both MVC as well as MVV. It's not like which one is best. It is depending on how you want to deal with. How you want to deal with and what is your requirement. It's not like you have to use only MVC or MVVM. Or we can use both in one approach. For some interactions, client side in the UI is enough. Some interactions, client side in the controller we have to do. That depends on your requirements, how you manage the data and display, right? This is basic how to handle, right? So this is both MVC as well as MVV. Same example I will give here as data binding dot component dot HTML. No TS is required if I am not using this category. Understood? Because you can try that by yourself. Huh? If I am not writing the category, I am not designing anything related to category. So it is pure using MVVM approach, right? Then you don't need logic for TS file, only HTML. Only HTML5 we have to manage. Okay. This is two-way binding technique, how we can access the data and manage. So in Angular, two types of data binding, one-way binding and two-way. Two-way binding is managed by NG model, right? Once we know this, now we can design some more examples here. Now we will see how to create some real-time scenarios by using what we have learned. We will take some real-time examples. So, and we will try to design them by using these options. For that, we need to learn some more directives also. We will see that, right? That we'll see in next session. Tomorrow we will do that, okay? In tomorrow's session, we will design one real-time example using these concepts, what we learned. Then you will get a clarity where they are correctly used, right? Tomorrow we'll continue.